RBD is actually where these patients will wake up and they'll be pretty coherent. And if you ask them about the dream, they can give you quite a bit of details that'll make sense. And that whatever action they were doing was actually relevant to the content of their dreams. For example, jumping off a cliff, then I'm jumping off the bed. So there is that match between the content of the dream and the actual action that I did. They wake up, they're coherent, they know what happened, so to speak, and they're all distressed about it. Like, hey, I don't want to hit a person who's sleeping next to me is probably the most precious person in the whole world. And so it's super distressing. So it brings its own challenges. But the good news is we know quite a bit, which is what we're talking about today, and we have good ways to control it.
Welcome back to the Hidden Sleep Disorder Show. And today we're talking about a condition that sounds like something almost out of a movie. Patients physically acting out their dreams while they sleep. And today, Dr. Saini is here to explain what is really going on. I'm super curious about this. I know that there's people that say they sleep talk, they sleepwalk, all kinds of things that people talk about and don't really know the intricacies of. So I'm excited to dive into it. But before we do, how are you? How's everything going? It's a pleasure to see you as always.
Pleasure to see you too, Leila. Let's dedicate this one to all the actors. I know New York has a big presence of all kinds of actors. And since we're going to be talking about acting out your dreams, I think we should dedicate to all those hardworking folks.
Absolutely. I love that. To my fellow New York City people, this is for you and for all the actors out there as well. And I think that this is super interesting because I feel like every time we talk and we do one of these shows, I find out something I never knew about. And this is another one. So most people like myself have never heard of REM behavior disorder. So even though it can kind of look or maybe even sound a little dramatic and potentially disturbing to the people who witness it, what's actually happening? So can you kind of explain what REM behavior disorder is and why it happens during sleep?
So yes, brace yourself for a long answer, I guess, okay? Because it can be, you're absolutely right. It's very disturbing, especially to the person who's witnessing or who's actually getting the brunt end of things. And I'll explain what this is for our listeners who've never heard it or are not aware of this. But what happens is, as a person is sleeping, and they might be dreaming, and generally these dreams are forceful, violent, they're unpleasant for the most part. They're not, the sweet, sugary dreams. I'm either chasing somebody, I'm fighting off something. And then what ends up happening is, as I'm dreaming, I'm acting out on my dreams. And guess what? And if, let's say, I am fighting somebody in my dream, I throw a big punch and I hit my wife or I hit my bed partner. And then next thing you know, we're having all kinds of fights around that. Or, I feel terrible. And I've seen several patients who are extremely distressed that, they're the nicest person when they're awake and they feel so sorrowful that, my gosh, I hit my spouse, I hit my wife. And generally, this is a disorder which is more common in men above 50, which is, a lot of things we deal with are more common in females. But this is one of the sleep disorders that's more common in male population. Having said that, though, I have plenty of women patients who have this disease as well. But if you look at the general population spread out, it's much more common. Now, the funny thing is, in REM sleep, our body is supposed to be paralyzed. That's one of the nature or hallmark of REM sleep or REM sleep, which I think our listeners would like to know. What the heck is REM sleep and what are you even talking about? So when we look at sleep during the in-lab sleep studies, sleep generally is classified into two big sort of buckets. One is, hey, are you in REM sleep or rapid eye movement? That's what REM stands for, meaning my eyes are rapidly doing this. And the most common way to see this is in newborn babies, because as they are falling asleep, their eyes are doing this. And a lot of young parents will know what I'm talking about as they see their baby get into sleep. Because as a newborn, my brain goes right into REM sleep and my eyes start to move around. And that's the only thing that's moving around. But rest of my body is pretty much paralyzed. I can't move my legs or arms. And that's the paradox here. And that's why this is called a disorder, that, hey, we expect your muscles to not be active, but here I am. I'm throwing punches, I'm kicking, I'm jumping out. Actually, let me share a story. I had a veteran, and this is one of my first few cases of RBD that I encountered back when I was doing my sleep fellowship. So this gentleman, he was dreaming, and this is a common sort of recurrence for him, where he was dreaming that I'm jumping off a mountain, jumping off a cliff, jumping off somewhere. But one night, it just so happened that he's dreaming that he's jumping off the cliff. And guess what? He jumped out of the bed, and he didn't know what was going on. So he hadn't really taken any precautions, which we'll address later in the show. But he hid his corner of the eye in the corner of the nightstand and almost lost his vision. And then obviously had to go through a long healing process. So it has, serious consequences. You can hurt or injure yourself. You can injure your bed partner and spouse. So, the consequences are real. Safety concerns are real. So that's really what REM sleep behavior disorder looks like or presents itself, where people are screaming, shouting, punching. I have patients who punch so many holes in the wall of his bedroom because his bed is right next to the wall. I had a patient who the couple was so distressed, and they've been dealing with this silently. And that's the other thing I've noticed is people keep suffering for this without really knowing what the heck is going on here, just thinking that this is a natural sort of pattern of sleep, which is not the case at all. And this person showed me how they would chain themselves at bedtime so that they're not hitting their spouse. And I mean, it did work, but that's very extreme measure, right? I mean, imagine sleeping that way for several years of your life. So I've had incredible stories. Actually, since we're sharing some stories, this is a little bit of, it's funny, not funny kind of thing. I have two sisters and they're twins. And it can sometimes happen it has some genetic predisposition. And so they were traveling and they were sharing the hotel room, and they started noticing that my sister is screaming, talking, doing all kinds of stuff in her sleep. So the first sister did it. So the second one noticed it. And then, an hour or so later, the second sister did it in her sleep. And then, so the first sister noticed her. And in the morning, they're talking to each other that, guess what, sis, you were screaming and shouting. And then the other sister is telling her the same thing. It's like, oh my God, we both did that. And so they both sought, and came to us basically as a twin couple to seek help. It's like, what the heck? We accidentally found out that we are both doing this.
That is wild. And I've seen that with twins where they kind of do like the blind test, and it's like they'll put on like a song or say to do something, and you'll see that they do the same thing at the same time. I've always thought that's interesting, but even in sleep is interesting.
That's one of my wildest RBD stories, I guess.
That's wild. And I'm just thinking about it now. I know when people have sleep paralysis, they'll feel like they're falling, but they don't actually fall. They'll have that feeling. So is there anything like correlated between the two, or do people who have this disorder maybe feel like it's sleep paralysis? They'll feel that and then they'll wake up and they're actually mid motion or something along those lines?
No, it's not so much. So they're different things. Sleep paralysis is different. RBD is actually where these guys or these patients will wake up and they'll be pretty coherent. And if you ask them about the dream, they can give you quite a bit of details that'll make sense. And that, whatever action they were doing was actually relevant to the content of their dreams. So if I'm, for example, jumping off a cliff, then I'm jumping off the bed, right? So there is that match between the content of the dream and the actual action that I did. For example, if I'm punching somebody in the dream, then I'm actually throwing punches, or I'm screaming loudly at someone and I'm screaming in my sleep. So the content of the dream matches with the action that's actually being witnessed by their bed partner. So that's a big difference. So, because sometimes it's hard, and it can be hard to differentiate it from, let's say, people who are having some sort of seizures in their sleep, and they could make sounds, and sometimes it may look like, oh my gosh, is this RBD or is this a seizure disorder? But generally, seizures will leave you disoriented, will leave you confused. Your stories and dreams are not really going to match up. But this is pretty clear. They wake up, they're coherent, they know what happened, so to speak, but and they're all distressed about it, right? Like, hey, I don't want to hit a person who's sleeping next to me, is probably the most precious person in the whole world, right? And so it's super distressing, so it brings its own sort of challenges. But the good news is we know quite a bit, which is what we're talking about today, and we have good ways to control it.
Absolutely. And speaking about that also reminds me of previous episodes where we've talked about how certain sleep disorders can be confused or maybe thought of as another sleep disorder or another illness or something along those lines. For example, when you mentioned seizures, I mean, in college, I had a roommate who unfortunately severely suffered from epilepsy. And I think that a key component of the differences, and I could be wrong, is the coherence. And I remember living with her and her having to explain that this can potentially happen, and to see it can be frightening. And it was. And, there were times she'd fall out of bed and she almost hit her eye on the bedpost and things like that. And she would wake up and be on the floor, have black and blues, and have no idea where it came from. So I think it sounds like the big differentiating factor is maybe being coherent versus not.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. And, there's a strong linkage between other neurological conditions too, which, RBD to me is not just a separate entity. It's actually, we're realizing that almost 74% of these patients will end up having what we call alpha synucleinopathies, conditions like dementia, conditions like Parkinson's disease, conditions like Lewy body dementia. So these are some of the neurological disorders that I think RBD is actually a sign and symptom that's warning us of what is to come in the future for these people. And that's what makes it very critically important to not ignore it or not miss it.
That's so interesting. I actually just hosted another show where we were talking about Lewy body disorder. So that's interesting to see how they could potentially be related. And I think to really understand this disorder, it also helps to really understand what is supposed to happen in a healthy brain and body during dreaming sleep, and what normally really keeps the body still and paralyzed during REM sleep, and what really goes wrong in patients with this disorder.
So think of it this way. REM sleep, one of the jobs when my brain neurons are in that REM sleep mode, they inhibit or block the neurons that control our muscle activity. So as my brain is in REM sleep, the neurons that are supposed to tell me, okay, move this, move that, punch, or whatever, they keep all that activity blocked. So then that blocking mechanism is either destroyed or messed up, that it's not doing the blocking job properly. So then there is all this activity traveling to these muscle groups. And instead of being paralyzed, I'm actually lifting my arm or vocalizing or screaming or kicking or jumping. So that's really, obviously there's molecular level explanations too here, but I don't think that's going to be relevant for our audience. But I think it's safe to assume that, hey, one of the purpose of REM sleep is to keep my muscle activity under check, and somehow it's not able to keep that blocked. And so there is this spike in muscle activity that's happening in response to whatever my dream content might be.
And I think that it's a lot of people probably assume this. I think I assume it too if I'm thinking about it in the moment, but it's kind of a similarity that people would assume that like any unusual nighttime behavior kind of falls into the same category. Like let's say sleepwalking or night terrors or anything along those lines. So how or is REM behavior disorder different than that? Or are there some?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, they can't be farther apart, honestly. And that's where it becomes crucial because you're absolutely right. The presentation or the outcome could look very similar. And then I have to determine, okay, are these episodes happening during your REM sleep or are these happening during your non-REM sleep? For example, things like sleepwalking, right? Which is very common, especially in younger children. Hey, my kid walks. And in fact, there are plenty of adults who do sleepwalking. And then there are something called as sleep terrors or night terrors where you're waking up screaming, and that could be extremely distressing to the parent. But a lot of these things are only happening in non-REM sleep. But just from clinical history, it can be extremely hard to differentiate some of this. But the REM behavior disorder is only happening during REM sleep. And that's where the in-lab sleep studies are paramount in terms of differentiating some of these things for us. So generally speaking, yes, we get the clinical history and we would suspect REM behavior disorder, but the in-lab sleep studies where, even home sleep tests can't help you with that, because it doesn't really record your EEG brainwaves. So it's kind of pointless. So that's where we need to look at your muscle activity, because we're capturing that, your brain waves, and some of those features we look into in more detail and to make sure that, okay, I see a lot of muscle activity happening in REM sleep, or I get a video evidence of you actually throwing punches or kicking and whatnot. And then I sort of see, okay, was it happening during the REM sleep stage? And if the answer is yes, then that's a clear answer for us that, okay, we're dealing with REM behavior or REM sleep behavior disorder.
Absolutely. And so you did mention a lot of things that can happen to a bed partner as someone that shares a bed with someone who is suffering from this. And you kind of touched on some of the injuries, but are there any injuries that you see that are common? Or let's talk about even the worst scenario that you've experienced.
So yes, injuries is really the biggest concern here. Well, one of the biggest concern. The second big concern is the future of my brain health, right? Because as I mentioned, it's strongly, strongly linked. It's almost, think of it as a warning sign that, hey, most likely you will convert into having tremors from Parkinson's, or some people actually may already have it. I have some patients who are dealing with early dementia symptoms. And then when they come in for evaluation for that, I'm finding out they've been dealing with this REM sleep behavior disorder for almost 10, 15, 20 years ago. And generally it's been a precursor that shows up, much earlier before you would even think that I have some neurological disorder. Okay. You may have no other symptom of Parkinson's. You may have no other symptom of dementia. And only thing you're noticing is these REM sleep behavior disorder episodes. So that sort of gives us a window into what's to come in the future. And safety generally is obviously addressed because that's paramount, because either you're going to hurt yourself. And a lot of these people, honestly, by the time they come see me, they've already injured or had some injuries or their spouses had injuries, or both. And sometimes it causes, what we call sleep divorce, where there's, sleeping in separate rooms, which
Rooms,
is
yeah.
because, hey, I can't sleep with someone, because then your spouse is not sleeping, right? If she's worried about getting hit,
Right.
she's going to get insomnia just thinking about that.
Absolutely. And I could imagine how, especially if you're sleeping or not control your muscles, it's probably like a very heavy hit too. It's kind of
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
absolutely
This can be brutal. Yes. So, one thing I tell patients is that, hey, go look at your sleep environment, check your bedroom, and take out everything that could potentially hurt you. We've had times where we ask patients that if their bed was too high, that, hey, you need to get rid of the bed. You need to just put the mattress on the floor. So, if you took a fall, then at least you're not falling from 4 feet high. You're just a few inches above the floor, right? But luckily we do have medications to help control these behaviors, and they're fairly effective, which is a blessing as a treating physician, because nothing annoys a clinician more, where you have a disease but you don't have a treatment. But luckily, we have medications that can effectively control these episodes so everyone can have a peaceful sleep.
absolutely. And I think one thing that we keep kind of touching on is those that do have a bed partner. So it's kind of interesting because these symptoms can happen and patients who don't have a bed partner may not really be able to describe what's going on or even really know that it's happening for a while. So in those scenarios, what goes on? What does the diagnostic process look like for those that don't have a witness to their behaviors?
Right. So, I've had patients where like, hey, doc, I woke up and I had a bruise on my hand and I had a hole in my drywall. So those are some of the clues, but you're absolutely right. We then lean heavily on the in-lab sleep testing. And for a lot of these patients, it may just be an accidental finding that I'm telling them. They may have no idea that I'm doing this. And if they underwent a sleep study, let's say for sleep apnea, or like I mentioned, there were a few patients that got sent to us from neurologists for figuring out why are they having memory changes. And then, because the neurologists like to rule out sleep disorders as part of memory changes. And sometimes we find out that way. And then patient has really no clue that they were doing all this. So yes, you're right. Some patients will find out just from the test itself without realizing that they were doing it. But a lot of patients, if you interview them, they'll say, oh yeah, my bed is all messed up during when I wake up. I don't know how I'm such a restless sleeper. Like my sheets are all over, or they might say, hey, I fell down from the bed, and they would blame it on something else, maybe a pill did it, or maybe I was just too tired, or maybe I had alcohol. So, we like to find excuses and explanations for these things, but really without the sleep study, that would be very hard to pinpoint.
Absolutely. And let's say once a patient is diagnosed, the conversation does eventually kind of shift from what is happening to what can actually really be done about it. And you mentioned that there is a lot of things that can be done. So, what are the treatment options that are available? And you did mention some of the safety measures that are recommended for the bedroom environment, but what are they specifically?
So the most common ones is to look at all the sharp furniture, the height of the bed, and then some patients, some couples actually have told me that, hey, we ended up getting a California king size bed so that we have the most amount of room. And I've had, couples where they said the spouse moved either to the other edge of the bed, or they put a railing around the bed. So bed railings are helpful, making sure there are no sharp edges on the nightstand and they're covered. So those are some of the important things. But honestly, the restraining, I mentioned physical restraining where this person was just putting, chains and whatnot to stop from flailing. But basically, we use chemical restraint and we put patients on medications. One of the most common one is clonazepam or Klonopin, and that seems to pretty much control majority of these REM sleep behavior disorders. And sometimes we have conditions that trigger these REM behavior disorders. Those are secondary RBDs. And for example, if I have terrible sleep apnea and my oxygen keeps dropping, then there are chances that's triggering your REM behavior disorder. And then fixing your sleep apnea most likely is going to make a big dent in those behaviors. So looking for those conditions and fixing those will generally help. There are certain medications, believe it or not, can trigger these REM sleep behavior disorders. And the most common ones, because these are very, very commonly prescribed, are the antidepressant medications. The SSRIs can trigger this. A lot of our elderly patients who have heart conditions or who have high blood pressure, they get put on beta blockers, and those can trigger these RBD symptoms or episodes. But, some of these medications, you could never be off of those. For example, beta blockers can be a main sort of therapy to maintain your heart health, and you can never get away without compromising your heart. So then you have to figure out, okay, how do I go around that? So secondary RBD, basically you have to look at that whole picture, and that's really the job of a sleep physician to figure that out.
That's so interesting too, how it can stem from something else. But are there scenarios in which they just have this disorder and it's not correlated with, like, let's say sleep apnea, for example?
Absolutely, and that is actually the majority of RBD cases, okay? But small percentage will have sleep apnea just because it is so common, in our population. So sometimes it can be extremely hard. And you can have both, It's not uncommon for me to find that they have sleep apnea, and even after I treat sleep apnea, they're still having these episodes. Then I know sleep apnea wasn't the major driver here. They're just having these isolated, so we call it isolated RBD or isolated REM behavior disorder, meaning it's its own thing. But like I said, it's sort of a warning signal for us that, hey, look out for dementia, look out for Parkinson's, look out for other neurological conditions down the road.
I think that that's a key takeaway too, as it can kind of be an indicator of potentially other things to follow. And I think that is really, really important to speak about. And like I said, I just did a show speaking about Parkinson's and Lewy body, and it's so interesting for me now to see how this can lead into that. It is really, really interesting, and I think it is a big indicator, like you said. And I think that I learn so much every time we talk about all these different disorders, and that's why perfectly titled show, Hidden Sleep Disorders. But thank you so much for really helping listeners and myself as well really understand this condition and why sometimes it can seem frightening and misunderstood. And rightfully so, there is a lot of frightening things that are involved, but it definitely sounds like there's also a lot of treatment options and a lot of ways that you can really manage this disorder, and really also showing why it really deserves medical attention and something that just shouldn't be ignored or kind of swept under the rug. It is important to talk about and see a sleep specialist for, especially if you have a bed partner, or even if you don't, because if you're by yourself and having these episodes, it can be just as frightening, if not worse, depending on the scenario. So it is important to shed light on and really get diagnosed and get evaluated for sure. And before we do wrap up, is there anything else that you want to mention before we wrap up the episode?
I think you hit the nail in the head. You're absolutely right. Do not ignore this condition. This has a lot of consequences for your health, for even your planning your life. If I have this and I'm thinking about, okay, what I'll be doing 20 years from now, it will change what you can do or cannot do. So do not ignore it. If you or someone is suffering from this, do not suffer alone. That's why we're here.
Absolutely. I think that was very well said. And thank you again for really educating us on this topic. And for all of our listeners, make sure that you are following, subscribing, and sharing the show. And I can't wait to speak with you soon. It's a pleasure as always, and we'll talk soon. I know we have a good episode lined up for the next one as well.
That's right. Thank you, Leila. You take care.